Welcome to a special bonus interview for Holy Post episode 471. In the regular episode, I spoke with Matthew Sorens from World Relief about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Afghanistan and what's being done to rescue our Afghan allies as the U.S. military withdraws from the country and the Taliban retakes control. In this bonus interview with David French, we look at the military, political, and cultural implications of the U.S. withdrawal. David is a friend of the Holy Post and the senior editor at the Dispatch. His writing and analysis there about Afghanistan has been among the most insightful that I have found, and I highly recommend you check it out or listen to him on the Dispatch podcast like I do every week. Apart from his work there, David French is also an attorney, the author of numerous books, and an Iraq War veteran, experience you'll hear him discuss in the interview. What follows is about 30 minutes of the full 1-hour conversation that I had with David French. The full unedited interview is available exclusively for Holy Post Patreon supporters. So if you've not yet joined our team, head over to holypost.com and click the Support Us button. You'll not only get access to fantastic bonus interviews like this, but you'll also help us grow the podcast to reach even more people. One final note before we jump in. This interview was recorded on Monday, before the bombings on August 26th near the Kabul airport that killed dozens of U.S. soldiers and Afghans. That's why that attack is never mentioned in the conversation. Okay, here's my interview with David French. David French, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always such a joy to be here.
Well, I listen to you regularly on the Dispatch podcast, as well as Advisory Opinions, I have to admit. I'm becoming one of those nerds.
Oh, I love it. The legal nerd is the best kind of nerd.
Well, I'm sort of an armchair legal nerd in that I get lost in some of the jargon between you and Sarah from time to time, but I'm trying to learn, and I love it. Yeah. I've been learning a ton. Well, really appreciate it.
Good. Well, we try. We need to be less jargony. We really do. So,
well.
Every now and then I have to stop and say, okay, let's explain that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that way as a, theologically trained person. You can get into issues that you think everyone understands, but the level of Latin jargon that goes on sometimes is like, I never took Latin. I don't understand what you're talking about. But anyway, all that to say, you are wonderful at explaining complicated things. And few things are more complicated right now than Afghanistan, which is why we wanted you to come back on to help our audience understand some of what's going on there. And we could spend hours and hours and not come to any clarity on this. But let me begin by putting things, as I've been watching what's unfolded in the last couple weeks, it feels to me like things can be put into three buckets or three stages. First was the decision itself to leave Afghanistan, which it feels as if that has been on the table ever since bin Laden was killed in 2011. The Obama administration and then the Trump administration and certainly now the Biden administration have all been looking for an exit from Afghanistan.
Right.
So that's kind of issue number one. Issue number two then is how the U.S. ultimately left. Whether we can talk about the way the Trump administration negotiated its exit and then the way the Biden administration executed that, which has been, I think, on most people's opinions, a real failure. And then the third bucket of question is, well, those two things are both in the past. What do we do now, given the reality of what's happening? We can, Monday morning quarterback this thing all day long, but what do we do now? So I'm going to start with the third issue and kind of work backwards. Starting with what moral obligation do we have to the Afghans that we have left behind? And speaking specifically to Christians who might be listening to this, what Christian obligation do we as American Christians have to the Afghans that we've left behind?
Right. Well, let's look at it and let's put people. You started with some buckets. Let's answer with some buckets. Okay. So let's say that the people for whom we have the highest degree of obligation to protect are the people who risked their lives and their families' lives to serve alongside Americans. So these are interpreters. That's category, the easiest sort of category to explain. These are people who walked on patrol with American soldiers, who sometimes intervened to help save American soldiers' lives when Americans were wounded. I mean, these are the people who are side by side with Americans during our deployments, who often form very close bonds with Americans. So I didn't serve in Afghanistan. I served in Iraq. I recognize that there are differences, but there are some commonalities too. And one of the commonalities that we had in Iraq was we had Iraqis that we served very closely with, and they formed bonds. One of the jobs that I had, I was a JAG officer for 2nd Squadron, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. I did a bunch of different things, but one of my jobs was to help bring interpreters to the United States who wanted to come to the United States. And here's how close some of these bonds were. I would have full bird colonels writing me and saying, this interpreter can live in my home. That's how much I
Wow.
trust him. He can live in my home. And if it helps for him to immigrate to the United States, that I can say he can live in my home, then tell him he's living with me. So I would work on things like this. And so that's sort of your highest degree of obligation, is the people who served alongside of us. And I would add, and their families, because the Taliban are exactly the kind of people who will massacre an entire family in vengeance for the actions of, say, an interpreter or somebody else. So then that's sort of like the what you might call the easiest category, but nothing's easy here, because that's tens of thousands of people once you include the families, in a situation where we now basically control the Kabul airport, and that's about it. And so our best hope right now, reasonable hope, is to get as many of those people out of the country, excuse me, as we possibly can. Now, then you start to move into, well, wait a minute, there's a humanitarian disaster unfolding right now in the nation of Afghanistan itself. And I wrote a piece some time ago about how the world community in 2005 got together. Every UN member state in 2005 got together and unanimously agreed on a concept called responsibility to protect. And this is one of the many manifestations of the effort since the Holocaust to sort of say never again. How can we say never again again? We couldn't say, Rwanda happened, Cambodia happened, all of these genocides and mass atrocities have happened. What's a principle we can articulate to try to really reaffirm that we will never again have this kind of genocide? And the concept was called the responsibility to protect. And what it said is essentially a nation has a responsibility to protect its citizens from what's called a mass atrocity. But if the nation cannot protect its citizens from a mass atrocity, the world community should protect citizens from mass atrocity. Now, that doesn't always mean an invasion, a military action, and that's off the table. Like, there's no reasonable course of action right now where the Americans are going to sort of reinvade Afghanistan, absent some sort of mass atrocity against Americans. So we're not looking at a situation where there's a reasonable possibility of a massive military intervention. But can you establish safe havens, for example, in neighboring countries for Afghan refugees? Can you do things like that can help protect people from mass atrocities? That's another thing that should be on the table. So this is sort of the range of options here, but the highest obligation, it seems to me, is to evacuate the people who literally laid their lives on the line to work alongside of us. And that is a direct betrayal if we don't remove those people from Afghanistan. The Afghan people more broadly, we have an obligation as citizens of the world community towards our fellow human beings to do what we reasonably can to try to protect them from a mass atrocity, and should do those things. But as of right now, the idea that America is going to sort of reinitiate hostilities in Afghanistan to protect the population of Afghanistan from the Taliban is not in the cards.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that first group, those who most closely aided and supported the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and translators, things like that. I talked to Matthew Sorens a few days ago from World Relief, and he also
Right.
talked about this issue. And he said, what people need to understand is the initial goal is not that we take all of these perhaps tens of thousands of people and bring them to the United States. We just need to get them out of Afghanistan. We just need to get them
Right.
to a third country where they can be safe, and then process and perhaps bring them to the U.S. or not. But there remains very high objection, particularly among white evangelicals, to any refugee resettlement in the U.S., including from the Middle East and Afghanistan. What do you say to those Christians who oppose refugee resettlement in the U.S., and how does the issue of Afghan refugees differ, say, for example, from Central American refugees that might show up at the southern border?
Yeah. So these kinds of terms, I think a lot of what happened is a lot of terms get conflated. Okay, so a refugee is not the same thing as a migrant, for example.
Right.
So, as a typical matter, if you're talking about people coming over the southern border, you often have people who are fleeing sort of the background level of criminal violence, or people who are moving into the United States to try to get greater economic opportunity. As a general matter, unless you can sort of trace their reason for coming to the United States to specific kinds of political or religious persecution, what you're talking about are migrants, people who are
Right.
immigrants.
They're not seeking asylum, they're just seeking a better life in the
Right.
US.
Right. Now, a lot of them do seek asylum because of that background level of violence, but there's a threshold you have to prove
Right.
under the law to be considered worthy, considered to be legally entitled to asylum. Now, a refugee is something else. Now, a refugee process and refugee resettlement is something that's different entirely from this, and a lot of people conflate these two things. And so, refugees tend to go through a rather lengthy process of determining not just are they entitled to refugee status, but also a vetting process, a resettlement process. This is something that is a intentional, planned process that is not just here's a boatload of people coming to the U.S. So what a lot of people think when they think of these flights leaving Kabul, they're not landing as a general matter. They're not leaving Kabul and landing in JFK or in Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. This is step one of a process. This sort of
Right.
step one is we're getting you out of harm's way. And now look, I understand terrorists. I understand terrorists' intentions. Is it possible that the Taliban or Al Qaeda could try to infiltrate, or ISIS, who has a presence in Afghanistan, could try to infiltrate into the ranks of this crush of people leaving to the U.S.? Yes, it is possible. And it's one of the reasons why that you have, for example, this is step one of a process, not the whole process. And so, but a lot of these people are trying to get onto these flights have already been very thoroughly vetted just to have the job that they had alongside of Americans. And many of them have proven themselves by saving American lives, by killing Taliban in combat. I mean, this is a category of people who, if you want to say, have they established their bona fides? Yeah, they have. But even this is not a situation where we don't have an airlift from Kabul to Atlanta or from
Right.
Kabul to JFK. That's not what's happening. This is a process. And the other thing that I would say is, I think that lack of understanding of there has been a shift, Sky. There's been a shift. So when I grew up I think I'm older than you by a decent amount. And so I grew up in the height of the Cold War. So, I vividly remember when KL-007 was shot down. I vividly remember when ABC showed the day after and about nuclear war, and
Mm-hmm.
there's like hushed tones at school the next day. Like, could this happen? And one thing I vividly remember is, if you were growing up a Cold War conservative, refugees from our enemies were our friends.
Right.
When people tried to defect from the Eastern Bloc, when people defected and tried to leave these countries that were our enemies, we were, yes, this is proof. This is all demonstration of what is that we have a better civilization. I mean, in East Germany, they built a wall to keep their people in, and so there has been a big change in the last 20, 30, 40 years, where you live in a country that people are so desperate to reach that they are hanging onto the wheel wells of transport planes. That's how desperate, and dying, falling from transport planes trying to reach us. And we're going, nah, we don't want you.
So what do you attribute that change to? Is it, I mean, the I think a liberal would immediately just assume, well, it's race. It's because of the refugees that we're thinking of, that we're looking at today, are darker, they're browner than the Eastern Bloc European refugees that were trying to escape the Soviet grip. Is that too simple an explanation for the shift?
Well, I think it's a complicated shift that different people have different reasons. And for some, race is a reason. For some, religion is a reason. These are Muslims who are trying to get into these cargo planes. So you've got race as a reason for some. You've got religion as a reason for some. Some, quite frankly, have been whipped into a frenzy of fear by right-wing media
Yep.
that these are plane loads of potential terrorists instead of plane loads of people who have risked their lives for Americans. So you've got you've got some racism, you've got some anti-Muslim bias, you've got some just plain old fear whipped up, you've got some conflation that there's always a overestimation of the impact of foreign money and the influx of refugees on the American economy. Because again, we're talking about refugees here, not migrants.
Right.
Refugees have for many years been an insignificant percentage of American total immigration. So there's a conflation of these refugees with the larger issue, for example, of the massive influx on the southern border, which does present resource strains, which does, we do have to think hard about how many people is too many. These are things that a nation has to think about. But the refugee issue is a drop in the bucket compared to that.
And it feels like this situation is also different in that there are legitimate refugees coming from, say, Central America, or who are legitimately seeking asylum. The difference in this case, though, is we didn't invade those Central American countries and contribute to some of the chaos that is now happening in Afghanistan. I mean, it was a fallen, broken state before we ever got there. But like you said at the beginning, many of these people who are clinging to these planes trying to get out of Afghanistan are the people who sacrificed their lives and families and fortunes and reputations in order to help the United States.
Yes,
so,
that's the thing that I keep going back to is
right.
Stop conflating all of these things, because these people are folks who, many of them, bled more for American soldiers than the average American ever will.
Yeah. I mean, I just pulled I pulled up some statistics before we started talking. Total U.S. military deaths in Afghanistan stand at about 2,400.
Mm-hmm.
Afghan military deaths on the side of the U.S., not Taliban.
Right.
Afghan military deaths, 66,000.
And that's one of the reasons why it's been so grievous to hear people say, well, the Afghan army is a bunch of cowards.
Yeah.
The Afghan army endured, between 25 and 30 times the casualties we did in raw numbers. And as a percentage of the population, that's just off the charts more than we did. But one of the things that happened is that when we yanked the rug out from under them, and we've seen this happen before, we saw this happen in Iraq, for example, in 2014. One of the things that ends up happening is you literally deny them the ability to fight the way they've been trained to fight.
Yeah, and you wrote a wonderful piece about this.
Exactly. And so what we've done with both the Iraqi army, for example, and the Afghan army, was we tried to, this is an overgeneralization, but I'm just going to trust that there are not too many listeners who actually trained Afghans and saying, but you're missing this nuance and that nuance. But here's the overgeneralization that I acknowledge as an overgeneralization. Essentially, what we tried to do is create these armies as like mini-me versions of the U.S. Army, where you fight in a similar way, with a similar kind of doctrine, with a similar reliance on air support and artillery, et cetera, et cetera. And when you yanked out the American presence, you didn't just yank out the small number of troops that we had, were sort of a break glass in case of emergency, fail-safe backup. You pull out the contractors who are servicing the aircraft. You're pulling out the intelligence that provides insight as to where the enemy is. You're just yanking the rug out. And so all of a sudden, an army isn't capable of fighting the way that it was trained to fight. And here's the super, super, super important point that people need to realize. When the American army pulls out, and I'm using a term coined by Bing West, who's a journalist and probably spent more time in Iraq and Afghanistan than almost any journalist in America. He wrote a book about the surge called The Strongest Tribe. And he said, why is it that America did so well in the surge in Iraq? And the answer came from an Iraqi sheikh who said, you Americans are the strongest tribe. We decided to join the strongest tribe. if you take the strongest tribe out, who's the second strongest tribe? Well, it's the Taliban in this circumstance. And so what ends up happening is you then have your former allies with the strongest tribe gone. They are then less powerful than the Taliban, and they know it. And they also know the Taliban is ruthless, that they will be
Yeah.
massacred.
I-
And
I-
so you start to negotiate things like switching sides or melting away into the population to try to save your life and your family's lives. It's the most predictable thing in the world. In fact, it was all predicted.
Yeah, some of the pundits I've heard, and even President Biden has basically blamed the Afghan army for what's happened, and they're quote unquote failing to fight for their own country. Those kinds of statements, though, assume that courage is opposed to intelligence. That to be courageous, you have to also be stupid. And what you're articulating is no. When the biggest tribe leaves, the people who remain aren't dumb. They're going to figure out what is the best course of survival, and it may be laying down their arms or siding with the next strongest tribe. So I can't really blame the Afghans for simply acting in their own self-interest here. Let's stay on this military question, though, because this is another point that I've not heard a ton of people talking about. The population of the United States that is most opposed to welcoming immigrants and refugees are also typically the population of the US that most supports the military.
Right.
What does this withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way it's been done, the way we left our allies, what does it do to the credibility of future US military engagement around the world? And coming on the heels of what happened in Iraq and with the Kurds, are we undermining the US military's effectiveness in future campaigns if allies no longer trust us to protect them? And so forget the immigrant issue, the refugee issue, just the national defense and military issue. Is this just a bad self-destructive policy?
It's let me put it this way. This is a policy that in all likelihood, I mean, look, we have to approach the future with humility. We can't predict the future, but to the extent that you can sort of think of probabilities, the probability that this will lead to greater American combat deaths and greater American combat engagement overseas, there's a strong likelihood that this will over time lead to larger number of American combat deaths and a larger amount of direct American combat intervention overseas. And here's what I mean. For a long time, especially since the rise of ISIS, and we reinserted several thousand troops into Iraq and Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. And then after the surge in Afghanistan, we had wound down to, 14,000 troops, 10,000 troops, whatever. We have used local allies as force multipliers. And so essentially what's happened is you would have a few American troops who had access to air power, who could provide intelligence, who could provide emergency assistance on the battlefield. But we used thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of local troops to fight that direct ground combat. I'll give you a good example. 2014, U.S. had pulled entirely out of Iraq. ISIS starts rampaging through, and a couple of divisions of Iraqi troops just melted away rather than defend the city of Mosul in 2014. So 2016, we come back to Mosul and begin the process of retaking Mosul in one of the largest, bloodiest urban battles since World War II. There were a few hundred Americans involved, very, very, very few American casualties, thousands of Iraqi casualties, thousands. And that was because the Iraqi troops, many of them the same people who melted away in 2014, came back, but they knew they had American support. They had American air power. They had American artillery. And they knew they had the strongest tribe on their side again. And they fought and they bled and they died and they retook Mosul and they drove out ISIS. And so who's going to do that? Now, if you say, we're with you, we're with you. Now, it was in the American national interest to get rid of the ISIS caliphate, but we could rely on tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers to fight instead of like the Battle of Fallujah in 2008, where the Marines had to go in directly and do this with minimal Iraqi help, with much higher casualties. And so that's my concern. It's not that the American military is any less lethal and is any less well-trained, is any less capable. Our military has performed again and again and again, just with the utmost professionalism. Not perfect. There are bad actors in the military, like every human institution, but by the standards of military history, performed so very competently and performed in many ways self-sacrificially and nobly and heroically in this fight. But they've also been able to rely on a lot of other allied troops to be there with them. And the question is, sort of a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. What kind of precedent have we set again to all of these local allies the next time we ask them to deploy beside us?
It reminds me a little bit of drawing from my history background, both the largest tribe idea and your explanation of what happened in Mosul with just a few hundred American troops empowering and emboldening the Iraqi troops. It reminds me of the American Revolution. Where would we have been in that fight against Great Britain without the French? Right.
Right.
The French didn't give us a huge number of troops, but they gave us their support and some weapons and some ships and the assurance that we've got a big tribe on our side with the French who also hate the British. Like we never probably could have succeeded in that revolution without the help of the French. And we couldn't expect the Afghans or the Iraqis or others to succeed in their campaigns without the help of the Americans. Okay. Getting at who's at fault here a little bit.
Oh boy.
Depending on which cable news network you tune into at any given moment, it's entirely the Biden administration's failure, or it's entirely the Trump administration's failure for negotiating this exit in the first place. Here's my question. Is it really a matter of one administration taking blame, or even multiple administrations taking blame, or are these different American administrations, going back to Obama's, really just doing what the American people have wanted them to do all along? Are we really the ones to blame here?
So let me begin like this. I think that key last question you asked is very poignant. And I'm going to get to the answer to that in a roundabout way. I think one thing that has been underestimated ever since December 2001 is how hard this was always going to be. Okay. And so in September 12th, 2001, if you told American people, we have to go to Afghanistan, all right, the American people, those who are historically minded at all, or followed current events at all, would go, oh boy, because that's the country that just chased the Soviets out.
Right.
The Red Army met a meat grinder in Afghanistan, and that's where we're going. It's called the graveyard of empires. This is going to be hard. If you read the Bush address to Congress, he does not promise in September right after 9/11. I went back and reread it. It's not some sort of promise of swift and sudden victory. Okay, it's we're going to have a fight against this new kind of enemy, etc. So then what happens? We go into Afghanistan, and seemingly at the snap of a fingers, with a bunch of air power, a few special forces soldiers, this allied army called the Northern Alliance that nobody had heard of, they sweep the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, just sweep them away, just swept them. I mean, it was stunning. So then what happens? Afghanistan immediately goes to the back of our minds because we did that. We won that, right? Quick, easy, amazing, heroes all around. Now we just got to hunt down bin Laden. But here's my argument. At no point since 9/11 has the Taliban been anything other than the second strongest tribe in Afghanistan. And so even when we scattered them after December, a lot of them headed out, they went to ground or they headed into Pakistan. Osama bin Laden escaped into Pakistan. So ever since 9/11, ever since our first intervention post 9/11, there's never been a point where the Taliban were not the second strongest tribe. And what then happened is just a cascading series of mistakes, often untruths. The American people were often deceived as to how well the war was going. Growing public discontent, an absence of leadership that really put clearly in front of the American people why we're there, which was ultimately about preventing another 9/11. It wasn't the nation building aspect of it was kind of if you want to ever get out of Afghanistan, you had to create a dynamic where there was a second strongest tribe that wasn't the Taliban. And that required state building. That required,
and wasn't worse than the Taliban.
That wasn't worse. So we're going to build something better that can defeat the Taliban. That was going to be a long-term project. And so what ends up happening is we have year after year after year of things are going better than people falsely saying things are going better than they really were. You have a failure of leadership outlining to the American people and reminding them why we're here and what we are actually succeeding at. We had, in fact, protected America from a terror attack, anything like that 9/11 scale. And then just a hard fight. I mean, if people understand anything about counterinsurgency, one of the hardest challenges in all of military, in all of one of the most difficult military challenges of all is how do you defeat an insurgency when the insurgency has a safe haven where they can go back across a border, rest, be reasonably immune from attack, refit, recruit, and then cross back across the border to fight when they wanted to fight.
That was the story in Vietnam. That was the story in Afghanistan.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Correct. And interestingly, it was generally overall not the story in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the reasons why we were able to, in the surge, be much more successful than in the Afghan surge. But anyway, so you have this incredibly difficult military challenge. You have a lot of messaging that's misleading. You have a lot of discontent on the part of the American people. And so this consensus locks in on the left and the right that we should get out. We should get out. But I would call it a soft consensus. This was nobody's top line voting interest. This is not what was top of mind. But there was a broad bipartisan consensus to get out. And in the absence of leadership, people sort of defaulted to that consensus. And then it was handled horribly. We haven't even gotten into the Trump peace deal with the Taliban, which was just an absolute travesty, which would have been a national scandal and outrage, again, if Afghanistan was top of people's minds.
All right, friends, that wraps up the first half of my conversation with David French. Believe it or not, there's a whole nother 30 minutes, and it gets into some really interesting stuff, including what this pullout of Afghanistan says about American culture and our willingness to sustain sacrifice over time for causes beyond ourselves. As you would expect, David had some really insightful things to say about that. So if you want to get the full hour interview, head over to holypost.com and click the Support Us button to discover how you can become a Patreon supporter. For those of you who already are, thank you so much for making this show possible and for making it possible for me to talk to really smart people like David French and bring their insights to you. We'll catch you next week on a full episode of The Holy Post. Thanks for listening.